Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to Westpac, to the Honourable Michael Wood, and thank you so much for very ably stepping in at such short notice. And thank you to all of you for making the time to join us here today. For those of you that I don't know, which will be most of you given the amount of time I've spent overseas, I'm Mcgrath, and I'm the CEO and have the privilege of leading the Westpac team, many of whom the leadership team are in the room with you here today. And one of my reflections is it's so lovely to be back in Aotearoa after such a long time away, and particularly lovely to be back at a point in time when we can all finally start to see each other face to face. And if the energy levels in the room are anything to go by, there are plenty of opportunities being hatched up over a very nice piece of food. So it's great to hear the post-budget breakdown and insights from the Minister, and particularly looking forward to the Q&A. I think in the Q&A is when you get the most insightful comments, and so despite the fact that you're stepping in at late notice, I really hope that there are some great questions for you. So what jumped out for me about the budget was this balancing act between the need to support New Zealanders now in the short term and those very immediate pressing needs about inflation and interest rates, but also that balance about investing for the longer term, particularly in terms of health and the environment. And what many of our customers are telling us, particularly our business customers, is they're grappling with that same complexity. How do they help their business transition in the short term, but also make them incredibly resilient for the future? And as a bank, we clearly don't have all the answers, but what I'm hearing from our customers is that the conversations that we're having with them, where we help them to tackle some of those complex issues, are incredibly important. And as you try and get that balance between the shorter term and the longer term, a friendly ear can be incredibly helpful. But I also think as a bank we have a bigger role to play, and we have a bigger role to play in Aotearoa. The challenges that we've got as a nation are structural and they're long term, and that means we all need to choose to do our part. A real focus that Westpac has had for a long time, and I'm delighted to be able to work with the team on making even bigger, is both sustainability and inclusion. And I think to build the Aotearoa that we really want to be living in, collaboration is the key to doing that, where we see big businesses working together to make a real difference. And it's been a delight to see over the last 6 months some of the work that the team have been doing on sustainability-linked lending. And we've been doing that with some of New Zealand's biggest names, like Genesis, like Spark. And on inclusion, we've been doing some great work with the government too. Again, it's a collaboration approach, where we're helping people who couldn't have otherwise get into homes through a great collaboration with Ke Anga Ora. I'm talking about these things purely to give some examples about when we work together, we are hugely stronger than if we try and do these things by ourselves. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Amit, and he's going to talk us through his reflections. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Minister for Transport and the Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, the Honourable Michael Wood, to speak about New Zealand's fourth wellbeing budget. With many of my Accenture colleagues scattered across the room, I welcome you all to this event today and thank you all for taking the time to be here. My name is Amit Singh, and I'm a Managing Director of Accenture's Economic Insights practice. We work with governments and businesses across the world, right here in New Zealand, leveraging real-time data to help decision makers understand changes in markets and industries and develop strategies in response. About 30 months ago, as the world first learned the word coronavirus, we suggested that the economic shock of the pandemic would be marked by 3 intersecting and overlapping phases: response, recovery, and repositioning. Through the pandemic, in collaboration with Xero, my team worked to develop the Xero Small Business Index. The index tracked the health of small businesses in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand during these phases of the pandemic. With small businesses making up over 95% of the businesses in these countries, the index acts as a really good barometer of the health of the overall economy. So what did we find? Well, what we found was that New Zealand led the way. New Zealand had the fastest recovery, the most sustained improvements, and is today close to 35 points ahead of where it was pre-pandemic on this index. This is even more impressive given that New Zealand faced a reasonably tough lockdown at the beginning of that pandemic. The health of Australian small businesses across that time also rebounded, but less so, and is now above pre-pandemic levels by about 10 points on that index. But the recovery in the UK is still slow and incomplete, 8 points below the pre-pandemic. And what you can see from that is that New Zealand's performance has been significantly better than the others. So New Zealand emerged with better health and economic outcomes. But today we also meet in the context of significant global headwinds and the most challenging inflationary conditions globally in decades. 60% of the advanced economies in the world now have inflation that's above 5%. In more than half of the developing world, inflation is over 7%. We're in a perfect storm. Energy and agricultural price shocks driven by the war in Ukraine and geopolitical instability, as well as increasingly unpredictable climate change, combined with supply chain disruptions due to COVID and other things, labour availability and cost constraints, and obviously the overhang of COVID stimulus that artificially inflated household budgets, have all contributed to this challenging environment for inflation. So as we move firmly through the recovery phase and into the reposition phase, it's important to keep one eye on these conditions while also being able to make the investments to address some of the challenges ahead, which Catherine mentioned, particularly in relation to health and the climate. These challenges represent wider trends about policy development and public service delivery, which we've seen around the world in all the work that Accenture does for governments in pretty much every country in the world. On health, the global trends now make clear that there's a need to have a holistic view of a country's budget allocation, because what we've found is that 80% of health outcomes are the result of social determinants of health. So housing, education, employment, access to food. And what was interesting was that the pandemic highlighted the severity of these inequalities in the global healthcare systems. People of lower socioeconomic or minority groups were disproportionately affected. So any effort to expand patient access to healthcare services and overcome barriers to access offer an opportunity to improve health outcomes, not just for particular individuals, but across the community. New Zealand's nationwide approach to improve healthcare reflects this trend towards ensuring equal access, or, as you described it, ending the postcode lottery. Similarly, on climate change, advancements in renewable energy and the fall in the cost of renewable energy have provided the best environment ever to accelerate decarbonisation. Growing global demand for renewable energy will see an increase in renewable energy capacity by over 60% in the next 5 years. The global sales of electric vehicles have doubled in literally 1 year. The significant reduction in the cost of renewable energy has provided such a feedback loop that it's basically generating an investment market in of itself. But importantly, what does this all mean for the economy and for communities? I think as the Prime Minister has said before, climate change is a massive jobs opportunity. Shifting skills demand and changing climate risk requires support for training to reskill and upskill workers across a range of different industries to transition to net zero, but also to capture the opportunities that come from the new green economy. Significantly, the global view on climate change will also need to promote support for regional neighbours in the Pacific, and that's something that institutions like Westpac and others have been really key to, but we need to think about that in a particular context. So these are the trends and these are the challenges that we've seen, and this is what was a function of the budget that we saw last week. But before I pass on, I wanted to thank the Trans-Tasman Business Circle for this opportunity, especially at this time. I rather feel that in recent years, Australians have been better at expressing our affection for New Zealanders than we have been at showing our respect for New Zealand. But I'm very confident that recent events back home give us in Australia the opportunity to make that right. Let me give you one example. I know that the new Treasurer of Australia has often remarked about your approach on physical design and delivery as being the guiding light for advanced economies. Budgets are about addressing the challenges in the near term while preparing for the future, as Catherine mentioned. And they're about creating the buffers to withstand shocks. And let's face it, we've all seen our fair share of shocks in the last period. But what I think is really important is to not just look at individual efforts. I say this not just in terms of the well-being approach that is core to the budget, but all in terms of the targeted fiscal rules that are flexible depending on the economic cycle, or the data-driven approaches that underpin the budget in terms of funding for education through the equity index, or even mechanisms for developing resilience, like the New Zealand Income Insurance Scheme. It's actually all of those components and how you brought them together that's the key to the nature and the success of the budget. So I was delighted at the opportunity to join you today and to speak particularly as an Australian about how your approach is an inspiration to us across the ditch. So I'm very keen to hear the presentation. Let me introduce the Honourable Michael Wood. Michael is the MP for Mount Roskill and the Minister for Transport and the Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety. He's also the Deputy Leader of the House. As MP for New Zealand's most diverse electorate, Michael is also closely connected to New Zealand's vibrant and growing ethnic communities and is focused on ensuring that every person, regardless of background, has the ability to flourish and reach their fullest potential. He's also got a particular interest in Auckland's urban development, and he's a keen supporter of more high-quality, affordable housing and rapid public transport in his electorate and across the city. Prior to his parliamentary role, Michael was an Auckland Council member in his community and has held various roles, providing advice to Habitat for Humanity and as a senior negotiator for the financial sector union, FinSec. Along with his wife, Julie, and their 3 young sons, Michael lives in Roskill South, where he loves to tramp along the Waikowai coast, tends to a very neglected vegetable garden, and dreams of an alternative career as a roving international test cricket commentator. On that note, I'll pass over to the Minister.
E whakawhetai ana ki te kaihanga, e mihi ana ki te tangata, i te kaihanga tēnā koe, e ranganui e papa tuanuku, tēnā korua, i ngā mate, haere, 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 e te hunga ora, e te hau kāinga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. And my very warmest greetings to everyone who's gathered here today. And I'm not Grant Robertson. I do bring with me apologies from Grant Robertson. He is held up at the final part of the funeral service for Mātua Joe Hawke over at Oraki Marae. And of course, these events can sometimes move forward. And just as we were having the introductions before from Catherine and Amit, I was reflecting on those challenges that we face over the long term in our country and thinking about the contribution of someone like Joe Hawke, who 44 years ago led his people in the occupation of Bastion Point, who challenged authorities and assumptions at that time, and 44 years later leaves this world and this realm as a member of Ngāti Whātua Ōraki, an empowered, vibrant, active, successful iwi who is changing the lives of their people in this city. That is long-term thinking and visioning and changing things of the kind that we need. And I just wish to acknowledge him and his contribution today. Can I acknowledge Westpac and the Trans-Tasman Business Circle for organising today's event, and especially acknowledge the Singapore Business Circle for your presence today. The Prime Minister's visit to Singapore several weeks ago was extremely successful, and she reported back to Cabinet on very fruitful discussions there. I thought that the comments made by Catherine and Amit at the beginning were really on point in terms of the challenges that we face coming into this budget and how we've tried to balance the different factors in the decisions that we've made. I think that the last event that I came to in this room might have been 2018 or 2019. Certainly David McLean was still in his role as chair. I now meet with him in his role chairing Kiwi Rail. It was certainly the pre-COVID period. And the conversation then that I recall was very focused on the long term. A lot of things in the present at that point seemed pretty stable. and we could just kind of focus on those things. Well, we know what happened. And really that is the challenge that we face in New Zealand, as does every other jurisdiction. How do we manage to make our way through that sequence? We've now moved through response and recovery, and we are now repositioning. How do we move through that most effectively, bearing in mind that things are still enormously unsettled, and we'll touch on some of those points soon, but without taking our eye off the ball of those significant long-term structural challenges, which is really still where the big game is, if we want to lift the living standards of New Zealand over the long run and deal with some of those big challenges we face, such as climate change as well. So that was a really good introduction to the budget and some of the particular challenges and issues that we face. Now, is the clicker working here?
Oh, it might not be on.
Okay, just sort that out. That's all right, I think. There we go. Politicians can do some things. From time to time. Right, so look, I'll start with a few comments on the economic and fiscal outlook more broadly, which will draw a little bit on the international situation, but also some of the domestic settings. The first point, and this is one that will not be lost on anyone in this room, and if I can just reflect back a comment that Grant Robertson made early on in the period of COVID, uncertainty is the new certainty for us. We've come through the peak of Omicron, but by no means does that mean that we're into smooth waters for our country or for the international economy. Recent forecasts have downgraded international rates of growth. We all understand the particular pressures, tensions and uncertainties which are driving that. We are still in very significant and strategic parts of the world facing very real COVID impacts, particularly parts of China, which as we know flows on significantly across global supply chains. A range of international tensions, most notably the war in Ukraine, which does appear to be a long-run concern for the world economy rather than a short-term event, drives significant uncertainty, further supply chain impacts. And of course those international inflationary expectations that we heard from Amit about, which are being faced certainly across the developed world to a degree that we haven't seen for 30 or 40 years. We've also seen recent evidence coming out of some of the major exporting economies, Germany, Japan and others, of reduced export orders coming through over the next 6 to 12 months, which of course often is a lead indicator of challenging times ahead. So we have seen that downgrade in growth internationally. We do have a softer international outlook, and we're going to have to be very aware of that as we continue to build our approach as we reposition in this period. That said, and Amit commented on this I thought really well, our economy does continue to be enormously resilient. And we heard those stats about the relative success of our small business sector in its recovery from the massive jolt of COVID. We have seen, of course, particular sectors who have really struggled, hospo, tourism, for quite obvious reasons. But actually across the broad sweep of the economy, the resilience has been enormously impressive. And some of that has been about the stable settings that we have in New Zealand. A lot of it has been about the core resilience and capability that we have across our business sector. But also that has been coupled with the government support and settings that were rolled out over that COVID period. The wage subsidy scheme, I get around my electorate in Mount Roskill and just sort of go shop to shop through our small businesses. Most of them are still doing it pretty tough. Green shoots over the last month, it would be fair to say. But they're kind of down to the last scraps in the bank account often. But they're still here. And what they often reflect upon is that they're still here because there were interventions and support such as the wage subsidy which helped them to get through. So it's that government and public support which has enabled a core resilience, enabled people to hang in there, to reposition and readjust, keep going and keep employing people. And that's been enormously significant. And I don't think we can understate within this as well what the impact of broad-based infrastructure investment across the COVID period has been, particularly in regional New Zealand. The investment that went in through shovel-ready projects through the New Zealand Upgrade Program through this period has kept thousands of people continuing in work and business activity continuing to hold up. It is worth remembering that at the outbreak of COVID, the talk wasn't just of an extended recession, it was potentially of depressionary conditions, and we certainly have done better than that, acknowledging the uncertainty that is still there for people. The next graph is particularly important for us as a government, and I do draw people's attention to the pink dotted line that we have here. And this was the official projection of where unemployment might move to as COVID first crested onto our shores in early 2020, and it was predicted to peak potentially at around the 10% mark. And I know that if Grant Robertson was here, he would reflect back on what one of his guiding motivations for getting into politics was. And this was the early 1990s recessionary period, where unemployment rates in New Zealand did peak at around about 8 to 9%. And we had a whole generation, particularly of our young people, particularly in regional parts of New Zealand, where unemployment often peaked more at 20 to 25%, who just got left behind, who absolutely got shut out. And we are still dealing with some of the social consequences of that 30 years later. And so it was a real determination of us, as we went into this challenging period, that we would make the investments and put the supports in place to make sure that that was not the outcome. And if you drill down into those unemployment figures further, we've actually done proportionately better with some of the particularly vulnerable communities, our Māori and Pasifika communities, our regional economies, than we actually have across the broad headline figures as well. And that has been a deliberate approach that we have taken through this period. So we're doing enormously well here, 3.2% unemployment, lower than what we went into COVID with. And of course what that means is that the big problem that's on everyone's mind, of course, is labour shortages. In some respects, though, that is a better problem to have than the one that we might have faced at the beginning of this period. But we do need to give it serious attention. On the fiscal side, obviously one of the ways in which we dealt with some of those issues, helped the economy to get through, brought in the stabilisers, kept things going, was through significant fiscal stimulus and investment through this period. And there's no doubt that it was significant, but it wasn't necessarily hugely outsized compared to the scale of fiscal stimulus post the GFC, as this graph here demonstrates. What we're also very clear about is that over the medium term, our intention as a government is to return to surplus. That is predicted to occur by 2025. So to give a sense of comparability, that's a 5-year track back towards operating surpluses compared to a 6-year track post the GFC. So broadly speaking, we're following a similar track in terms of the recovery of the fiscal position after that shock, bearing in mind that that economic shock was a smaller one than the one that we faced in the wake of COVID as well. What this reflects is the balanced approach that we are trying to strike here, making sure that we do provide the support at the right times, but that we make sure that we get the books back into order, because we know that further shocks are going to come. And one of the reasons that we were able to make our way through this one is because there had been a 20-year pattern across successive governments of making sure that we had a stable fiscal position that gives us the headroom to respond when we need to. And that is very important and a key part of our strategy. This largely reflects on the previous set of figures that you saw and gives an indication of where government spending as a proportion of GDP is sitting. And of course what it does show is that in the wake of the investments made to get through COVID, we did have a peak there, in particular the wage subsidy scheme. We can't overestimate the scale of that. Approximately $17 billion across various iterations of the scheme, which kept large parts of our economy going. That is obviously phasing out now, and what you see from the forecasts here is that we effectively return to around about a position of 30% of GDP being government spending by approximately 2026. So we're returning to something that is broadly in scope of the historical norm. But for our government it is important that we do continue to make the investments there in areas that have been neglected for some time as well, and we'll talk about that shortly soon. At a higher level in terms of fiscal strategy, you will see that shortly before the budget, the Minister of Finance did refresh the fiscal rules, and this was extremely important for us. Obviously, as we went into that COVID period, action was required. We did need to do things that were outside of the norm in order to support the economy, to support jobs, and to support social equity as we made our way through. But as we transition out of it, it is important that we set in place sensible and balanced rules that guide government expenditure and decision making in the years ahead. So the two core things to be aware of are that we have adopted an Obergall target as the main fiscal rule. That means that we do intend to return to an operating surplus by 24 to 25, and then retain an operating surplus of between 0 and 2% of GDP thereafter. And that's coming back to the point of giving ourselves the ability to be responsive if and when we need to. Over and beyond that, if we look at the bigger, longer term strategic capital investments that we need to make, we've got a refreshed net debt ceiling of 30% of GDP. And really there are two things that are going on here. The first is that we have reset the way in which we measure our long-term debt position to be more consistent with what most other developed economies do. The key change there is that we're effectively looking at the whole of public sector position, which particularly in our case includes the ins and outs from the New Zealand Super Fund. And that gives us an overall position which is more consistent with how other developed economies tend to measure their government long-term debt position as well. And then secondly, we are providing ourselves with what we consider to be responsible space to be making the long-term investments that we need to across large parts of the infrastructure scene where we have seen a woeful underinvestment over the past 30 years. Whether it's transport, the waters, core health and education or housing infrastructure. We are going to need to make those investments, not just to catch up with the period of underinvestment, but to also plan ahead for significant growth that continues to come down the chute at us, and that's enormously important. That said, that even with that approach of giving ourselves additional headroom over the next 30 years to make those investments, our debt position is still going to be amongst the lowest in the developed world by some margin. Under the new settings, we'll be looking at around about a 15% of GDP debt position at the moment, compared to Australia at 36%, the UK at 84%, the US at 101%, or Canada at 33%. So while there's a need to be making these investments, we're trying to get that balance right to ensure that we do manage the books responsibly over the long term as well. Moving on to some of the key investments that you'll see within the budget this year. Budget 22 was a little bit different in that effectively over the week of the budget we kind of had two budgets. We had the normal budget that we generally roll out on the Thursday of that week, but then on the Monday we announced the emissions reduction plan and the first set of investments, $2.9 billion worth, in the Climate Emergency Response Fund. So we'll talk through some of those as we move forward. In terms of the COVID response, this was also a significant point in time in which we have actually closed down the COVID Relief and Response Fund. That's been a key way in which we've effectively set aside the money to deal with the challenges and the unpredictable challenges that COVID has thrown up at various points, and to some degree sort of quartered that off from the rest of our operational expenditure. We do feel now that we are at the point where we can end that somewhat unorthodox but necessary approach and mainline COVID response into our general expenditure and planning processes. We have within that set aside $1.2 billion as contingency over the forecast period, so that we have got the ability to make additional investments or provide supports if needed in the event of a new variant or other unpredictable circumstances. There's no doubt that top of mind for many people was cost of living as we went into the budget period this year. We heard from Amit that the inflationary pressures are significant across most developed economies. What we also know is that those pressures do fall disproportionately on low and middle income people, both in terms of absolute impact, but certainly in terms of proportional impact on living standards for those people as well. So we had choices about how we could cut this as we went into the budget process, and the very clear direction that we have set is to really try and focus the support into those people who need it the most. And that's not me, and it's probably not most people in this room. It is people on low and middle incomes who are feeling that stress at the moment. So that's rolled out across a number of initiatives that you've seen here. The cost of living payment, which is that $350 payment that will be being portioned out over 3 payments to people with an individual income of below $70,000 over the next 3 months. 81% of people will receive one of these means of support over the coming period. The fuel excise duty and RUC reductions, we put them in place for 3 months initially. We now have a 2-month extension of that in recognition of the continued pressure that we do see on fuel prices, which is a direct household budget impact for many people. And of course, coupled with that, the half-price public transport that we've put in place, which has been well received, and it's kind of done the double duty of providing our support for household budgets, but also supporting that transition into public transport as well. And what we've done with that one, beyond that period, is to really hone it in to the lowest income New Zealanders. So from about October, that half-price public transport will become permanent for about 1.1 million people on community services cards. So you can see the targeting approach at work there. Amit made an interesting comment before, and he reflected on health spending, and what he recognised within that is something that is absolutely true, which is that many of the health outcomes in our society don't derive directly out of money and things that we do within the health system. They arise just as much, if not more, from what we're doing in education, what we're doing in housing in particular, and other parts of our social and economic structure. And so it's really important to note that this is a wellbeing budget again. Our first budget in 2018 was a wellbeing budget, and this one is as well. What does that mean, beyond being a nice word? It means that we do this budget quite differently. We measure different things to what we measured before, and people like me as ministers, when we engage in the budget process with the Minister of Finance, we need to present our bids for budget support in different ways. We amended the Public Finance Act so that when the Minister of Finance reads out the budget, he isn't just reading out the fiscal bottom lines, as important as they are, but we measure and we track ourselves against wellbeing indicators for our society. We measure and we track ourselves against measures of child poverty at the budget as well. Because ultimately strong fiscals, when everything else over here is going in the wrong direction, what's the point of that? So the intergenerational wellbeing approach is enormously important in this budget as well. Range of significant measures there. Increased support for low-income people in terms of dental treatment, which has been something that I think for a long time many of us have felt requires additional investment. Supporting equitable access to child support payments, going to particularly our solo parents who often face a real inequity in this area and haven't had the same support as other parents. Significant further investment going into the housing space. We are doing extremely well on the housing supply space at this time. We're finally catching up with the growth that hasn't been catered for previously, but we need to continue to provide the funding to ensure that the underlying infrastructure is there for that ongoing growth in housing demand as well. And also significant investment into the disability sector, where we've got some quite exciting work going on towards more individualised support for people in disability. All of that said, the health system is still a critical area for investment, and alongside climate change was one of the biggest areas of focus in this budget. What you can see here are the sustained additional investments that the Labour government is making into the public health system, and you can see the very clear contrast with the previous government there. There are really two things going on here. One is the ongoing investments that we need to make for a fit-for-purpose health system that actually means that New Zealanders get equitable access to care, and we don't have that postcode lottery where people's access to cancer treatment and other critical treatments, medicines, operations is different depending on what part of the country you live in. And I don't think any of us would think that's sustainable or reasonable. So the Shift to Health New Zealand, led by Rob Campbell, we think is one of the more important things that we can do to be getting better outcomes right across the system for New Zealanders. A significant part of this budget is about that. It's about clearing the decks of the unsustainable deficits that are built up in the system and giving Health New Zealand and the Māori Health Authority the capacity to establish themselves. But there are also further investments in important areas of health. More medicines, $190 million through Pharmac, the biggest boost it's ever received. Significant further investment into mental health and wellbeing, and some of the others that you can see up here as well. One important one which is not mentioned, but it's dear to my heart. For the first time this year, last year our government approved a dementia action plan, and for the first time in the budget this year, funding is going into key priorities from the dementia action plan. If you want to think about an area of our broader health system where we have a tidal wave of need coming across it, go and do some research into dementia and the increased incidence that we can expect to see over the next 20 to 30 years. And we need support for people and their families there, and we're starting to deliver that. Significant and ongoing investment in terms of Māori and Pacific communities as well. As I said, this has been an important area through the course of COVID that we didn't see communities continue to fall behind, and we're continuing to make the investments where we know that it will make a difference for Māori and Pacific communities, particularly across economy, health and education, as you can see. On Monday Budget Week, we launched the Climate Emergency Response Fund, and the key point that I want to convey on this one is where it fits into the broader climate response. And the sequence goes something like this. In 2019, our Parliament declared a climate emergency. It was a clear statement of intent about our need to act in this area. We then passed the Zero Carbon Act based on the UK legislation, which puts us on the path to net zero by 2050, and said that we would set up an independent climate commission to give us the objective, non-political advice about how we could achieve that target sector by sector. We did that, they did their job, they consulted, they came up with a plan. Our response to that plan is the emissions reduction plan, which we announced on Monday, which sector by sector says how we will do it in 5-year carbon budget periods, whether it's transport, agriculture, forestry, energy, industrial heat. And we've got those targets in place. The Climate Emergency Response Fund is then the fiscal delivery mechanism for that. Recycling ETS proceeds, 18 cents per litre of the petrol when you put it in your tank now, to make sure that we're putting that back into initiatives that help us to ramp down our emissions to meet those targets. And the good news is that for the first target period, we are on track. So $2.9 billion in the SURF this year, with an additional approximately $1.5 billion that will be available in budget 2023. Significant investment going through there across all of these areas: transport, agriculture, energy and industry. If I can just touch on transport briefly, a little bit of bias coming through there. The approach that we've taken there is to look right across the system. Firstly, how do we support people to transition away from having to use our cars for every journey that we use, or to use them less than we currently do. We have to reduce our vehicle kilometres travelled if we want to reduce our carbon emissions. So significant investment into better public transport, walking and cycling options, PT prioritisation in our major cities. But we recognise that we're still going to have 3.5 million to 4 million vehicles on our roads by 2035. So taking urgent action to achieve a rapid transition to low or zero carbon vehicles. The good news in this space is that it's going gangbusters. Since we put the Clean Car discount in place last year, we've tripled our sales of electric vehicles every month. Last month, 40 to 45% of the new cars coming into New Zealand were zero and low emissions. Within 3 months of the Clean Car discount, we'd reduced the average emissions of the incoming fleet by 15%. It previously took 8 years to achieve that. So what we're doing in budget this year is building on that success, bringing in a scrap and replace scheme, which starts to recycle the existing car fleet and helps to upgrade them into cleaner vehicles, and bringing in a social leasing trial as well. Continuing to support businesses through this repositioning period is enormously important. A number of initiatives up here. The main one I'll just draw people's attention to is the one at the top, the Business Growth Fund. This is about addressing a long-term challenge that we know many of our SMEs have faced, and that is the ability to get access to the finance that they need to support them to grow to the next stage, when often the only collateral that they have to put up is their own home. So we think that there are better ways that we can do that to help unlock growth and potential with SMEs. The purpose of this fund and the $101 million that we've put up is to get alongside financial institutions and to build up models that can be practical to roll out to that sector. Coming in finally to the infrastructure deficit, which I have touched on. This goes across all key areas: health, education, transport and the waters. We face a significant deficit in this area. The hospital system that we inherited has major needs to catch up with our growing population. Our transport system has major needs to catch up, and it has major needs if we're going to transition to a decarbonised sector. We are going to need to invest more capital over the long run in this infrastructure, but the good news is that this is stuff that drives growth, drives prosperity and drives well-being. And so you get a sense of that scaled up investment from the graph that's in front of you here, and that's an important part of this package as well. For people who really care about the Public Finance Act and public finance system, a few key important things here. The first is that we've made a number of changes this year to just try and get the focus a little bit more long-term across a range of key areas. A 2-year funding allocation for the health system instead of the year-by-year begging bowl that we previously had. The Climate Emergency Response Fund, as I said before, is a multi-year appropriation to enable us to really plan ahead. And we've had a different approach to justice and natural resources this year, where the Minister of Finance has required departments and ministers to effectively work together on a joint budget bid approach, so that we start to get the linked up solutions instead of silo department-led outputs, which has often been a bane of these processes. So folks, in summing up, key things in Budget 2022 this year. Security. These are uncertain times. We do face a challenging couple of years ahead. We need to provide as much security and stability for New Zealanders as possible. Dealing in the short term with those cost of living pressures. Reforming the health system to deal with the big long-term inequities that we know are there. Taking climate action because it's the right thing to do and because there are opportunities for jobs in our communities if we get that right as well. Supporting business growth to continue the recovery out the other end of COVID, and continuing to support Māori and Pacifica aspirations, because we know that there is huge potential for everyone there if we get that right. So thanks very much, folks. That was my little fill-in effort on behalf of the Minister of Finance. Thank you for listening, and very happy and open to take any questions. Thank you.
We'd love to take a question from the floor, and while Luke comes to the first person, I suspect one of the things top of mind for everyone here is the challenge of labour, and you touched on it in your remarks. Can you share a bit more with us about some of the initiatives you're looking at to help the business community as you ended with?
So this is clearly a real point of pressure, and in most events a bit like this one, it's often the first question that I get asked. As I say, there's a problem of relative success here, and that we've done well in terms of keeping unemployment low. But we do know that in particular sectors there is a real squeeze in this area. The situation with borders complicates that. We're all very keen, of course, to get that reopening happening as soon as possible, and we've been accelerating that this year. But that does go both ways. It provides the opportunity for us to meet key labour needs within our market by attracting people back in, but it does also mean there is a potential for a flow the other way, which is just a normal part of what happens. Pre-COVID, it was quite normal for skilled people to leave New Zealand for experience overseas, and that will happen again, and we'll have to deal with that. The key initiative here is the rebalancing of the immigration system that the Minister of Immigration announced the other week. And this really is about trying to achieve a structural long-term rebalance that means that we can work towards that shift that we know we need to get to a more high-skill, high-wage economy by providing clearer and simpler pathways for those people with the skills that we need, such as much shorter, easier pathways to residency for people in particular sectors where we know that we need these people to build long-term prosperity and fill gaps that we can't fill quickly. But balancing that, pulling back a little bit from what was frankly a bit of a model under the old system, which was just turning on the tap of big numbers for relatively low wage parts of the economy without us collectively investing in some of the skills and workforce development programs that we needed to do. So that's the rebalance that we're trying to do. It will be something that we need to continue to work on and receive the feedback on, but I think that over the long term that will start to make a significant difference as well.
Excellent.
Thank you for talking to us today, Michael. A great fill-in job, I have to say. My question for you is really around transport in our budget and the success you talked about with electric vehicles. So given our reliance on the fuel excise tax and its funding model for roading and transport in general, how are we going to balance that as we see that drop and we see EVs increase?
Look, I can break that question down into two parts. One is the longer term challenge that we face in terms of funding the transport system. As most of you will be aware, it's primarily funded through the National Land Transport Fund, the Fed and Ruck that people pay into the system. And, up until some time ago, it was doing a relatively simple job, which was maintaining and steadily building the existing roading network. We are now asking that system to do more. There are investments we have to make into rail. There are investments we have to make into coastal shipping. We had a big announcement there yesterday. That was positive. Huge investments that we need to make in terms of the climate transition. And so that fund is having to work harder than it's had to in the past, as well as dealing with urban growth. And it is getting stretched. Last year, you'll be aware, we pumped an additional $2 billion in by way of financing to make sure that it could do the things that it needed to do. So there's a longer term piece of work that we have underway around the whole future of the transport revenue system. That'll unfold over the next couple of years. We previously thought that was probably a question we needed to have answered and implemented in about 10 years' time. I think it might be close to 5 or 6 years' time. But that work is underway, and there'll be significant community and business sector consultation about that over the next year or so. Secondly, the particular question about the electrification of the fleet. EVs are currently, as you know, exempt from road user charges, so they get a little bit of a free ride there. That was brought in by, I think, the Honourable Simon Bridges when he was Transport Minister, and it's something that we've currently extended to 2024 as a way of incentivising. Obviously, we now have the clean car discount in place, which is a much, much bigger incentivisation and really gets over the main barrier, which is upfront price. So that, I think, is a more significant way of incentivising that shift to happen. And we will be next year reviewing whether we do need to continue with that exemption from 2024 onwards, and that is something that we will consider. alongside the fact that as the EV fleet grows, the loss to the National Land Transport Fund will get bigger and bigger, and there'll be a point where it's not sustainable. So at some point that will have to come off, and we'll be considering next year whether that's 2024 or a little bit later.
Another question for the Minister.
Hello, thank you. It's exciting to see the motorway extension from Puhoi to Warkworth nearing completion. As a first-time buyer who recently purchased in Wellsford, I'd be interested to hear what data does the government use to build the next segment? For example, is it population? Is it revenue in the region? I'd just be curious to know. I see on the website it's a 10-year potential plan for the next segment, but if we could speed that up.
I knew where you were going with that one from very early on. You can actually drive on the first little bit of Puhoi to Warkworth. You can actually now drive on it, so it's worth a look. And that project will likely open next year. In terms of how we make the choices about those longer range investments, effectively there are two ways in which the decisions get made. The first is through the National Land Transport Fund, which is where Waka Kotahi determines how they're going to prioritise investment. And that is free from political judgment and interference. They're given effectively a bucket of money by us for renewals, for new roading, for public transport. They have to work within that, and then over a 3-year period determine what the priorities are. They use a multi-factor analysis in terms of determining and ranking what they will invest in through that period. Urban growth is a key part of it, decarbonisation is a part of it, dealing with the freight challenge is a key part of it. These things derive out of the government policy statement on transport that we put in place every 3 years. So they'll weigh up all of those factors, look at the benefits and the costs that arise out of a particular project, and then make choices. The other way that those investments get made is a bit more like the New Zealand Upgrade Programme, which we have underway now, where government determines that outside of that process, these are some priorities that, based on good advice, we will invest in. So that project, through that process, we're investing in things like, for example, the current motorway, busway and walking cycling expansion of State Highway 1 at the Drury end, the Penlink project, the Whangarei to Port Marsden rail project, the Takatima North Link in Tauranga. Similarly, we take into account a range of factors when we make those decisions, but that's more of a direct government decision. In terms of Wellsford, that'll be something that we'll consider further as we get towards the end of this project. One of the very real challenges that we're going to have to balance up with the transport system, I just have to be really clear about this, is that in an era in which we are trying to rapidly decarbonise our system, the balance of investments will change, and it won't be sustainable for the main focus of those investments to continue being on ever more and ever bigger roads. There will be a shift towards other transport options, and that is something that we're working through in more detail over the coming years.
One more question in the back, and then I'll invite Catherine to come back and propose the vote.
Thank you, Minister. My question is on inflation. We understand that the Reserve Bank is working hard to curtail inflation, but is there anything specific in the budget that you think would help raise confidence of households around this painful experience that we all are experiencing?
No, look, it's a well-framed question. There's both the role for monetary policy and fiscal policy here. The Reserve Bank is doing what it should. It's operating according to the mandate that it has. You've got a responsibility to manage price stability, but also to think about those broader economic impacts, including retaining maximum sustainable employment. And I think that the Governor's judgments the other day were solid with his board. In terms of confidence that people can take from the budget, I think there are two things that I would say. The first is that in the short term, it is important for us to provide the targeted support where it will make a difference. And so that cost of living package that I went through before is about us just helping through those households who are feeling the most pain at the moment. And I will just, in this discussion, I haven't gone uber political, but I will just be really clear about this, that we think that that is the better approach to take rather than broad-based tax cuts, which would potentially give people like me, very, very large income support. We think we do need to target the support to those who are feeling the pinch the most, and that's what we put in place through the budget. The second thing that I think people can draw confidence from is the fact that we are taking a balanced approach here. And you will have seen that in terms of the reimposition of fiscal rules and of the medium-term track in terms of government expenditure profile. There is a need for us to continue making investments. There is a need for long-term infrastructure investment. But over the next 5 years, we will be moving back towards a position of running surpluses and having that balanced fiscal approach. And that plays a part as well in terms of making sure that we manage those cost of living pressures.
Firstly, a big thanks to the Trans-Tasman Business Circle for making sure that we could have this event today and making sure that we were brought together to have the conversations. To admit, I love the insights and thoughtfulness that you shared, but also that particular reference about how Australians and New Zealanders should be working together for the greater good, and that we can definitely learn of each other, and as the borders continue to get more able for people to actually meet face to face, we should see plenty more of that. Minister Wood, you started with a wonderful reflection on a legacy that's being celebrated at Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei this afternoon. I had the privilege of being there with the team only a couple of weeks ago, and my exact thought that I took away from it was the intergenerational approach to both guardianship and stewardship was something that in a business context we could take many, many lessons from. And so I thought it was a very timely reflection that those are some of the things that we should also be thinking about. But the intergenerational nature of what you're talking through in the budget came through very strongly this afternoon. And I think particularly that reflection, which was an echo of why Grant got into politics in the first place, about we have an opportunity as a generation to learn from the mistakes that have been made by those who went before us. And so I think that was a very timely reminder. So thank you all for your time this afternoon and wishing you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Wood.